be me. Sancha T, Child Protection Officer at Social Services Department in Glasgow, investigating cases of child abuse and neglect across diverse communities, married for 10 years to a physical therapist. He's 39. Works at an NHS clinic specializing in sports injuries and rehabilitation for athletes and active patients. 2 daughters, ages 8 and 5, both bright and sensitive children. The older daughter is particularly observant and eager to please both parents. Marriage had been a solid partnership, focused on raising daughters with progressive values about gender equality and challenging traditional patriarchal family structures. Had been increasingly focused on raising feminist daughters who would recognize and challenge sexism from an early age, including within family dynamics, that teaching girls to identify problematic male behavior was essential preparation for navigating the patriarchal world they'd faced throughout lives, and started noticing husbands' parenting reflected traditional gender patterns. I wanted daughters to learn to question and resist. He'd roughhouse with them physically in ways that felt too aggressive for young girls learning about bodily autonomy and consent, would make casual comments about their appearance, like calling them pretty or beautiful, which reinforced focus on looks over accomplishments, would default to traditional division where I handled emotional caretaking while he handled physical play and outdoor activities. These patterns felt like subtle socialization into patriarchal gender roles I wanted to actively combat through a conscious feminist parenting approach. Brought up concerns with husband one evening after daughters were asleep. I'm worried about some patterns in how you interact with the girls. You're reinforcing traditional gender dynamics that I want them to learn to question. He looked confused. Like what specifically I thought we were parenting pretty equally. Listed examples of roughhousing that felt too physical. Appearance focused on compliments. Gendered activity patterns that seemed minor but were actually teaching daughters to accept male behavior that would harm them later in relationships. He seemed genuinely willing to consider feedback. I don't want to harm them. Those things seem pretty normal to me. But if you think they're problematic, I can try to be more conscious. Said being conscious wasn't enough. Needed to actively model feminist alternatives. That daughters were watching and learning what to accept from men based on what they saw him do. He agreed to work on it. Seemed committed to being better feminist parent. Started teaching daughters explicitly about feminist principles and recognizing problematic male behavior, including from their own father. Would point out when dad made appearance-based compliments instead of praising their intelligence or skills. Explain that focusing on how girls look rather than what they can do with subtle sexism. They should notice and question daughters, especially older ones. Started noticing these patterns themselves and occasionally correcting their father directly. 8-year-old would say, "Dad, you're commenting on my appearance again instead of my accomplishments." This felt like successful feminist consciousness, teaching her to advocate for herself. Even with father figure, posted about teaching daughters to recognize and challenge sexist behavior, including from their father, framed as essential feminist parenting, preparing girls to navigate patriarchal world, got supportive responses from feminist parenting communities. Yes, girls need to learn young that they can challenge male authority. Teaching them to recognize sexism in their own father is powerful. They'll be better equipped to demand respect from men in their lives. Also got concerned responses questioning approach. Using children to police their father seems unhealthy for everyone. Are you sure this is age-appropriate consciousness raising versus adult conflict? Dismissed concerns as people uncomfortable with children being empowered to challenge patriarchal authority. Expanded approach to teaching daughters about other problematic patterns in father's behavior. When he'd roughhouse physically with them, explained this was socialization, teaching them to accept male physical dominance, that they could and should set boundaries about physical touch even with dad who loved them. Encouraged them to tell dad when his physical play felt too aggressive or overwhelming. 5 8-year-old started saying, "I don't consent to this roughing." When Dad would initiate physical play, 8-year-old would point out, "Dad, you're using your physical size to dominate us right now." Husband pulled me aside after a few weeks of this. The girls are using therapeutic language to reject normal father-daughter play. I feel like I can't interact with them physically without being told I'm dominating them. Explained this was them learning bodily autonomy and consent, which were crucial lessons. That his discomfort was less important than their empowerment to set boundaries with men, including him. He looked hurt. "These are my daughters. I love them. I'm not trying to dominate anyone. This feels like you're teaching them to see me as threat." Said I was teaching them to see patriarchal patterns wherever they existed, including in loving fathers. That recognizing his behavior as problematic didn't mean he was a bad person. Just that he'd been socialized into problematic patterns. He didn't seem convinced, but backed off from argument. 3 months into teaching daughters feminist consciousness about father's behavior, family dynamics had shifted noticeably. Daughters would monitor Dad's interactions and point out problematic patterns using language I taught them. Would report to me things Dad had done that seemed to violate feminist principles we discussed. 8-year-old came to me after school pickup and said Dad made comment about woman driver on road. That's sexist stereotyping. 5-year-old reported Dad said, "I look pretty today." Appearance-based compliment, not achievement-based. This felt like successful consciousness raising girls developing critical feminist lens, even without my direct supervision. Praised daughters for noticing these patterns and encouraged them to continue speaking up about problematic behavior. Husband confronted me more seriously. "Our daughters are monitoring everything I say and do to report to you. They're not just setting boundaries. They're surveilling me. This doesn't feel healthy." Explained they were learning critical thinking and feminist analysis. That noticing patterns wasn't surveillance. It was awareness. That his defensiveness suggested he knew his behavior was problematic. He was quiet for a long moment. "I think you're using our daughters to enforce rules on me. Teaching them to see me through a critical feminist lens, while you get to be a good parent." Said I was teaching them to think critically about patriarchal patterns wherever they appeared. That if his behavior came under more scrutiny, it was because male socialization was more deeply problematic. He walked away from the conversation, looking defeated. 4 months into feminist parenting approach, started noticing daughters seemed anxious around their father. Would monitor his behavior carefully before relaxing around him. Would check with me about whether activities he suggested were okay or problematic. 8-year-old asked me one evening, "Is it okay to enjoy roughhousing with Dad, or is that accepting male dominance?" Said it was okay to enjoy physical play, but important to notice power dynamics. She looked confused. How do I enjoy it and notice power dynamics at the same time? Told her to trust her feelings. If something felt wrong, she should speak up. But could see this was a confusing framework for an 8-year-old trying to navigate a relationship with father. The 5-year-old started having nightmares about doing something wrong with Daddy. Would wake up anxious, asking if she'd been feminist enough in her interactions with Dad. Husband said this proved approach was harmful. Our 5-year-old is having anxiety dreams about whether she's being properly feminist. This has gone too far. We need to stop teaching them to analyze my every move. Said some discomfort was a normal part of developing critical consciousness. That learning to question authority, including parental authority, was healthy. Even if temporarily uncomfortable, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You're damaging our daughter's relationship with me. Teaching them to see me as a problem to be monitored and corrected. This isn't feminist parenting. It's weaponizing our children against me." Felt he was being dramatic. 5 months into the approach, my daughter's behavior had become noticeably different. The 8-year-old was parentified acting as enforcer of rules for both herself and younger sister, would correct 5-year-old's interactions with Dad using feminist language she'd learned from me, would report to me detailed accounts of Dad's behavior throughout the day, felt like a successful delegation of feminist consciousness raising, but my husband saw it differently. He stopped initiating physical play with daughters entirely, stopped giving compliments at all, whether appearance-based or achievement-based, became careful and formal with them rather than natural and playful. Daughters noticed. An older one asked me, "Why is Dad being so weird and distant now?" explained. Dad was adjusting his behavior based on feedback we'd given him. She looked sad. I kind of miss when he'd play with us, even if it was problematic. That comment should have been a wake-up call, but I dismissed it as a temporary adjustment period. 6 months into feminist parenting approach, husband asked for a serious conversation, said he'd been talking to his own therapist about family dynamics. My therapist says what's happening is called parental alienation. You're teaching our daughters to view me through an exclusively critical lens, using them to enforce your rules and monitor my behavior. This is damaging their psychological development and our relationship. Felt attacked by therapeutic language being used against feminist parenting. Said his therapist was likely defending patriarchal family structures. That discomfort with daughters having critical consciousness about his behavior was exactly the male fragility feminism challenged. He was very calm, which somehow made it worse. I've been documenting everything. The language you teach them to use about me, the monitoring and reporting you encourage, the anxiety and confusion they're experiencing. My therapist says this is emotional abuse of both me and the children. Started to argue, but he continued, I'm not asking you to stop teaching them about feminism. I'm asking you to stop using them as weapons against me. There are children who need a relationship with their father, not junior feminists trained to surveil me. Said, if our relationship felt surveilled, perhaps that said something about his behavior, not my parenting. He nodded slowly. That's what I thought you'd say. Which is why I've consulted with a solicitor 7 months after starting feminist parenting approach. The husband filed for separation. Legal documents cited my use of children to monitor, report, and enforce rules on him as creating a hostile environment for parent-child relationships. Claimed I was conducting parental alienation through feminist ideology. That daughters showed signs of anxiety and confusion about normal father-daughter interactions. Was shocked he'd weaponized the legal system against feminist parenting. Posted about husband filing separation over teaching daughters feminist consciousness. Got very mixed responses. Some feminist mothers supported me, saying men often reacted this way to empower daughters. He can't handle daughters who question his authority. This is classic patriarchal backlash, but many responses were deeply critical, including from feminists. You used your children as an enforcement mechanism. That's not feminist parenting. That's parental alienation. Children shouldn't be monitoring their father's every behavior. One child psychologist commented, teaching children to surveil parents creates anxiety and damages attachment. Your daughter's nightmares and confusion are symptoms of this. This approach is psychologically harmful regardless of ideological justification. Started to realize maybe I went too far, but felt defensive. 8 months after feminist parenting approach started. In family court for custody arrangements, husband's solicitor presented evidence of approach, including my social media posts about teaching daughters to monitor his behavior, daughter's statements to court-appointed child psychologist about feeling confused about relationship with dad, documentation of 5-year-old's anxiety nightmares about being feminist enough, my own posts explicitly stating, I taught daughters to notice and report father's problematic behavior. Court-appointed psychologist's report was damning. Mother has enlisted children as participants in adult ideological conflict. Daughters show signs of anxiety, confusion, and parentification, particularly the older child. father-daughter relationship has been damaged by mother's encouragement of surveillance and critical monitoring. This pattern is harmful to children's psychological development and attachment security. My solicitor tried to frame this as feminist parenting being misunderstood by the patriarchal court system, but the sheriff wasn't having it. This isn't about feminist values. It's about using children as weapons in adult conflict. Teaching an 8-year-old to monitor and report father's behavior isn't age-appropriate consciousness raising. It's instrumentalizing children for mother's purposes. Custody arrangement gave my husband more time than I'd expected. Split custody with detailed stipulations that I not enlist children in monitoring or reporting on father's behavior, that daughters attend therapy to address anxiety and confusion about father-daughter relationships, felt like the court had sided with patriarchal parenting over feminist consciousness, raising 9 months after separation. Daughters in therapy, as court ordered. Therapist reported the older daughter was showing signs of parentification and anxiety. She feels responsible for monitoring adult behavior and reporting problems, has difficulty just being a child in a relationship with father, struggles with anxiety about whether her interactions are correct or feminist enough. The 5-year-old was having ongoing nightmares and confusion about father, loves her dad, but has an internalized message that his behavior is problematic. This creates internal conflict. She's too young to process. Therapist recommended I stop discussing father's behavior with daughters in critical terms, that they needed space to develop their own relationship with him without my feminist framework. Felt like being asked to stop teaching daughters critical consciousness, but the therapist was clear. You can teach feminist values without teaching them to monitor specific parents. What you did crossed from consciousness raising into parental alienation. Your daughters are suffering the consequences 10 months after separation. Daughters were gradually rebuilding their relationship with their father. But damage was evident. The 8-year-old remained hypervigilant about his behavior. I couldn't fully relax with him. The 5-year-old would ask him, "Is this okay? Am I allowed to like this?" During normal activities. Both would still occasionally report his behavior to me out of habit before catching themselves. Father-daughter bond damage was slowly healing, but scars were obvious. Husband's new partner was a child psychologist who was apparently helping him repair relationships with daughters. Mutual friend mentioned she was very focused on creating a safe space for them to just be children with their father. No monitoring, no reporting. Just normal parent-child relationship. The girls are visibly more relaxed at his place. That stung but wasn't surprising. Year after feminist parenting approach destroyed the family. Reflecting on what had happened, had genuinely believed teaching daughters to notice problematic patterns in father's behavior was essential feminist parenting, but had crossed the line from consciousness raising into using children as an enforcement mechanism. Daughters had suffered with anxiety, confusion, and a damaged relationship with their father. Court had recognized this as harmful, even if the ideology behind it claimed to be progressive, posted honest reflection about approach, admitted I'd used daughters to monitor and enforce rules on their father, that this had damaged them psychologically and hurt their relationship with dad. That feminist parenting didn't justify instrumentalizing children for adult ideological conflicts, got responses from mothers who'd done similar things. I taught my son to call out his father's sexism. Now he's anxious and confused about loving his dad. Your story helped me see I need to stop. Another wrote, used my daughters to monitor my ex-husband's behavior. Court called it parental alienation. Lost primary custody. I wish I'd understood earlier this was harmful. 18 months after separation. Daughter is still in therapy, working through impact. The therapist said the older daughter was improving but still struggled with parentification. She's learning she doesn't have to monitor adults. But those patterns are deeply ingrained. 5-year-olds, nightmares had stopped. But she remained anxious about doing things right. Still checks whether activities or feelings are acceptable. Working on helping her trust her own experience, both had a stronger relationship with their father than with me. Chose to spend more discretionary time at his house where they could just be children, rather than my house where they still felt subtle pressure to be conscious of feminist principles. 2 years after the approach destroyed the family, the husband got married to a child psychologist. The daughters were flower girls at the wedding. Looked genuinely happy. Photos showed them relaxed and playful with Dad in ways they hadn't been in years. His wife was apparently very skilled at creating an environment where they could heal from damage I'd caused. Felt combination of gratitude that they were healing and grief that I'd caused harm that needed healing. 3 years after feminist parenting disaster, in my own therapy, working through what happened, therapist helped me understand I'd confused feminist parenting with control. You wanted daughters to see their father through your lens. Used feminist ideology to justify enlisting them in adult conflict. They paid the price in anxiety and damaged relationships. Asked if I could repair damage with my daughters. She was honest, maybe partially over time, but they'll always remember feeling like they had to monitor their father for you. That you use them as weapons in adult ideological battle. Trust is hard to rebuild after that. 4 years after separation, daughters were doing better. But relationships were permanently altered. They had a close bond with their father and stepmother built on acceptance and safety. The relationship with me was more careful and bounded, loving, but not fully trusting. 8-year-old told her therapist she felt like she had to be careful what she said around me, that she worried I'd use her words or experiences for ideological purposes. The 5-year-old was less articulate but showed preference for father's house where she could just play. Court-ordered family therapy sessions were helping but couldn't fully undo years of damage. 5 years after using children to enforce rules on their father, writing about experience, article titled "I Used My Daughters as Feminist Weapons and Damaged Them," detailed how I taught them to monitor and report father's behavior, how this had created anxiety, confusion, and damaged their relationship with Dad. How the court had recognized this as parental alienation, regardless of feminist justification. How 5 years later, daughters were still healing from damage I'd caused. Article got un intense réponse. Many feminist mothers were angry that I was giving ammunition to anti-feminists. Your experience isn't typical of feminist parenting. You're making it harder for women to teach daughters about patriarchy. But child psychologists and family therapists praised honesty. Essential reading about how ideology can be weaponized through children shows that progressive values don't justify instrumentalizing kids. Your daughters paid the price for your ideological project. Most painful responses came from daughters of mothers who've done similar things. My mother taught me to monitor my father's sexism. I'm 25 now and still struggling with anxiety in relationship with Dad. Your daughters will carry this damage long term. Current reflections 6 years after using daughters to enforce rules on their father, learned that feminist consciousness raising crossed into parental alienation, that teaching children to monitor and report parents' behavior instrumentalized them for adult conflict, that daughters suffered anxiety, confusion, and damaged relationship with their father, that he enforced separation to protect them from my weaponizing of feminist ideology, that 6 years later, they're healing but permanently impacted. Most importantly, that children aren't tools for enforcing adult ideological frameworks. They're people who need safe relationships with both parents. That's what I learned from using daughters as feminist enforcement mechanism and watching fathers enforce separation to protect them from me. 6 years later, daughters were closer to him than me. Healing from damage I caused with ideology, I claimed would protect them. That's my story about feminist parenting and learning too late that children aren't weapons even for progressive causes. 6 years of consequences from instrumentalizing my daughters to enforce rules on their father until he enforced separation to save them from me. And they chose him because he let them be children. While I made them soldiers in ideological war, they never asked to fight. Then I lost by winning their surveillance and losing their trust forever. That's my complete story about using children to enforce feminist rules 6 years after separation. Daughters were teenagers now, with clear memories of what happened. Older daughter was 14 inches therapy. Still processing the impact of being parentified and weaponized. Younger daughter was 11. Less articulated, but clearly carried scars from childhood confusion and anxiety. Both had confronted me directly about what I'd done during the family therapy session. The one 4-year-old said something I'd never forget. "You taught me that loving Dad meant monitoring him for problems. That I couldn't just enjoy being his daughter. I had to be your spy." Do you know how confusing that was? How much anxiety that created? I was 8 years old, and you made me feel responsible for policing my own father. 1 year, old added more simply, "I had nightmares about Daddy because you made me scared of doing wrong things with him. I was 5. I just wanted to play with my dad. But you made everything complicated and scary. Hearing their direct accounts of damage I'd caused was devastating. Tried to explain I'd thought I was protecting them. Teaching them feminist consciousness." 4-year-old interrupted. "You weren't protecting us. You were using us. Dad protects us by letting us be kids. You used us as weapons in your ideology, war with him." Family therapist asked how I felt hearing this. Had to admit they were completely right. That I'd instrumentalized them for adult ideological conflict. That their well-being had been secondary to proving feminist parenting points. 7 years after the disaster, writing a book about the experience at my daughter's request, they'd asked me to write honestly about what happened so other mothers might not make the same mistake. Older daughter said she'd even contribute a chapter from her perspective. Other kids need to know what it feels like to be used this way. Maybe if mothers understood the damage, they wouldn't do it. Book manuscript detailed complete story from my perspective. How I taught daughters to monitor and report father's behavior. How I'd convinced myself this was feminist empowerment, not parental alienation. How court had intervened and the father had protected them by enforcing separation. How 7 years later daughters were still healing from psychological damage. Older daughter's chapter was painfully honest. From ages 8 to 9, my job was being mom's spy and enforcer. I had to watch everything Dad did and report back. Had to correct my little sister when she enjoyed Dad's company too much. I had anxiety attacks about whether I was being feminist enough. I couldn't just be a kid with my dad. I had to analyze everything. It's been 6 years since Dad got separation, and I'm still in therapy. I still catch myself monitoring people's behavior, looking for problems. Mom's feminist parenting gave me anxiety disorder and damaged my relationship with both parents. Reading her chapter made me physically ill, but she insisted it be included exactly as written. Publisher was hesitant about including child's perspective. "This is very raw and could be seen as exploiting your daughter." Older daughter insisted. "Mom already exploited me by using me against Dad. Now I'm choosing to share my story to help other kids. That's different. That's my choice." Book published with both perspectives. Reviews were intense. Parenting experts called it essential cautionary tale. Shows how ideology can blind parents to harm they're causing. Daughter's chapter is heartbreaking account of being weaponized. Feminist critics were divided. Some accused me of betraying feminist parenting principles. "You're giving ammunition to people who oppose teaching children about sexism." Others appreciated brutal honesty. This shows the line between consciousness raising and instrumentalization. Important distinction too many feminist parents miss. Most impactful responses came from adult children of similar parenting. "My mother did exactly this. Taught me to monitor Dad's sexism. I'm 30 now. Still have damaged relationship with both parents. Your daughter's chapter made me cry. I felt so seen." Another response, from 2 5-year-old women, "Mom weaponized me against Dad using feminist ideology. Took me years of therapy to realize I was abused through being used. Your honesty helps me feel less alone." 8 years after using daughters as weapons, they were coping, but permanently affected. Older daughter had been diagnosed with anxiety disorder directly linked to childhood parentification. Therapists said pattern of monitoring and reporting had created hypervigilance. She'd struggle with lifelong. She learned her value came from catching problems and reporting them. That's a very difficult pattern to unlearn. Younger daughter had a better relationship with me now, but a clear preference for father's household. Dad's house feels safe. I can just be myself. Your house still feels like I have to be careful what I say or do. That assessment hurt, but was accurate. They didn't fully trust me not to weaponize their experiences again. 9 years after separation, ex-husband and his wife had a child together. Daughter's half-brother. They were excited to be big sisters. Watched them with babies during visits. They were natural and loving. Stepmother had created a family environment of emotional safety they'd never fully had with me. Older daughter mentioned during the therapy session, "At todos, I learned kids should just be kids. That parents protect children from adult problems. With you, I learned children were tools for adult ideological battles. I know which environment feels safer." That assessment hurt, but was accurate. 10 years after feminist parenting destroyed the family, daughters were 18 and 15. Older daughter was preparing for university, had decided to study psychology, said, "My weaponizing of her had inspired career interest in family dynamics and child protection. I want to help kids who get caught in parents' ideological conflicts. Want to teach parents what you should have known, that children aren't weapons. No matter how righteous the cause." She'd written a university entrance essay about experience, showed it to me nervously. Essay detailed being enlisted to monitor father's behavior from ages 8 to 9. Impact on her anxiety. Relationship with both parents. Ongoing therapy. How father's enforcement of separation had ultimately protected her. How she'd learned children deserve protection from adult conflicts regardless of ideology. Essay was accepted at a top university. She was offered a place in a psychology program, felt strange mix of pride and shame. Proud. She'd transformed damage into purpose. Ashamed I'd caused damage that needed transforming. 11 years after using children as an enforcement mechanism, younger daughter was 16. Had mostly a normal teenage life. But clear emotional scars remained. Told her therapist she still had nightmares occasionally about childhood confusion. Dreams where I'm little again. Trying to figure out if loving dad is okay. Waking up anxious before remembering, I'm allowed to just love him now. Therapist said this was a lasting impact of ideological weaponization. She was taught at a critical developmental age that loving her father required conditions and monitoring. That attachment was contingent on ideological compliance. Those early lessons created attachment patterns. She still navigates. Asked if damage could ever fully heal, therapist was honest. She'll always carry some impact. Just like any childhood trauma leaves traces, your ideological project traumatized your daughters. That's reality. You need to accept it. 12 years after the disaster, my older daughter graduated university with a psychology degree. Thesis was on parental alienation through ideological weaponization of children. Used our family as case study with both my and her permission. Thesis examined how progressive ideologies could be weaponized similarly to conservative ones, that instrumentalizing children harm them regardless of political violence or ideology. Won the award for Best Undergraduate Thesis in the Psychology Department. She presented research at a conference I attended, watched her present our family's destruction as an academic case study, articulate about damage, clear about mechanisms, hopeful about intervention, concluded presentation with powerful statement. My mother thought she was raising feminist daughters. Instead, she traumatized us by making us weapons. The ideology doesn't matter. The instrumentalization does. Children aren't tools for adult causes. There are people who need protection. Audience gave a standing ovation. Afterward, she found me. Thank you for letting me use our story. Maybe it'll help other families avoid what happened to us. Hugged her, both crying, proud of who she'd become despite what I'd done. 13 years after using daughters to enforce rules on father, reflecting on full impact, both daughters had made it to relatively healthy adulthood, but carried permanent scars, anxiety disorders, attachment difficulties, ongoing therapy. Closer to fatherhood protected them than to me who'd weaponized them, had transformed damage into purpose, but shouldn't have been damaged in the first place. My ex-husband had remarried and built a healthy family, protected our daughters by enforcing separation when I couldn't stop myself. Court had recognized parental alienation regardless of feminist justification. Multiple families had avoided similar damage by learning from my public mistakes, but my own daughters had paid the price for those lessons. Current reflection, 14 years after feminist parenting disaster, learned that consciousness raising crossed into weaponization when I enlisted children to monitor parents. That progressive ideology didn't justify instrumentalizing daughters for adult conflict, that they suffered lasting trauma from being used as an enforcement mechanism. That father protected them by enforcing separation from my harmful parenting, that 14 years later they're successful but scarred adults. Most importantly, that children are never appropriate weapons, regardless of how righteous the adult cause seems. That's what I learned from using daughters to enforce feminist rules, and watching fathers enforce separation to save them. 14 years later, my daughters are thriving despite what I did. Not because of my feminist parenting, but despite it because their father protected them, and they survived being my weapons to become their own people who teach others that children deserve protection from parents' ideological wars, even progressive ones. That's my story about weaponizing children and the permanent damage that caused. 14 years of living with knowing. I damaged my daughters for ideology, and they forgave me enough to still call me mom while knowing what I did forever.